Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's special lecture. And I am Soo-hyun Kim. I am a postdoc in the Center for Anthropocene Studies at KAIST. And as an early career paleoecologist, I'm truly honored to introduce today's speaker, Professor Axel Timmermann, one of the greatest researchers in climate change sciences. And Professor Timmermann is a distinguished professor at Busan National University in South Korea. And he's also the director of IBS Center for Climate Physics. The center is one of the world-leading climate research centers where about 40 scientists are working on the climate modeling as well as paleo data producing, which is really fascinating. Yes. And also, Professor Timmermann has received numerous research awards and published numerous excellent papers, but they are really too many to be told. Yeah, here because of the time limit. And I really hope that you don't mind it. Sorry. Yeah. But I want to emphasize one of his most fascinating specialties. And Professor Timmermann is the Earth is system scientist with a perspective integrating dynamics in multiple spheres in Earth system, including atmosphere and hydrosphere and biosphere and anthrosphere as well, which is really, really, yeah, really, really, really awesome. And so and then that thing is would be reflected in today's special lectures, which is title is the modeling climate change effects on the human evolution. Yeah, I said again, which is really reflect his hyper integrative work well. So Professor Timmermann, yeah.
Good morning, and thank you very much for this really, really, really nice introduction. And I would also like to thank Bomsun for inviting me to this interesting conference. The title of my talk sounds a little bit pompous, using climate models to understand human evolution. These seem to be very distinct research fields, but I will try to make the case here that there is an opportunity really to learn from both sides and integrate these two fields. This is work done in collaboration with many of my team members. I will present work in particular. Let's see if that works. Oh, that's very confusing. Ooh. Sorry, I'm still learning. Okay, in particular, my PhD student, El Gazella, postdoc Zhao Yang, and some collaborators from Italy, Switzerland, and also Germany. And I will acknowledge their contributions later on. Let's start with this morbid tree of human life, or maybe we should say human extinction. It's pretty much a tree of evolutionary dead ends, and so far it's just us surviving on the tree, Homo sapiens here. Whether we are an evolutionary dead end, we will figure that out, hopefully in not too near future. So this is the tree of Hominidae, and we have Ardipithecus, Australopithecus, Paranthropus. These were like earlier versions of our, let's say, template, and they died out around 6 to 3 million years ago. And then around 2.5 million years ago, our own genus, Homo, emerged, and this is the advent of our genus also coincides with the beginning of the Pleistocene, which is kind of interesting. So our ancestors and the many different species on this tree, they were exposed to climate change. Let's see, changes, gradual cooling that played a major role also in vegetation changes, as well as the glacial interglacial cycles that started to emerge around 1 million years ago in full amplitude. And I will talk about some of these species on the tree, in particular Homo erectus, heidelbergensis, Homo ergaster, Homo habilis, Homo neanderthalensis, nobody else but the Neanderthals, and ourselves, Homo sapiens. So we will ask some basic questions whether actually climate may have played a role in some of these extinctions, or maybe also speciations in the major dispersals, and other questions. But overall, you can say this is essentially a tree of evolutionary dead ends, and maybe climate played a role. At least that's an interesting hypothesis we can test. Okay, climate. Well, what do we think about what do we have in mind when we talk about the climate changes? And I will illustrate that here, looking at vegetation changes that we simulated using a climate model and a vegetation model. And this is the time evolution of vegetation over the last 3 million years. So right now we are at 2.7 million years ago. And this is something that a supercomputer can actually calculate. How realistic it is compared to the observations we have to test using existing paleo proxy data, of course. And I will show that later on. One thing that we can see is we have this major movement of some of the main vegetation zones up and down. Some of it in the tropical regions is driven by the precessional cycle, Earth's axis wobble with a timescale of 20,000 years. But then you also see these major glacial periods. These are still small glacial periods, but you see the glacial masses in Eurasia and also North America. If we go a little bit further, I don't want to wait too long, but if we go a little bit further, we will see that these swings, the glacial interglacial cycles, get stronger and stronger. Okay, and I mentioned the three major astronomical cycles. I mentioned already the precession. That's the axis wobble. So if my head is the Earth, you have this axis wobble that has a time scale of about 21,000 years. We have Earth's eccentricity changing with a time scale of 100,000 years and 400,000 years, which is very important actually. And then we have the obliquity with a time scale of 41,000 years. This is a change in the axis tilt against the ecliptic. Okay, why how does this astronomical pacemaker influence our climate system? It changes the solar insolation on our planet as a function of season and as a function of latitude. And that causes major shifts. So if you have gradients in the solar heating, that causes changes in the atmospheric circulation, precipitation bands, and eventually also vegetation, food resources, carrying capacity, net primary productivity, and so on. So this is a simulation up here on the right, showing the effect of changes in Earth's axis wobble. So two phases using a climate model on precipitation. So the green means we have more precipitation, and this is for a period where the northern hemisphere summer is closer to the sun, such as like 11,000 years ago. And we see actually there is much more rainfall in the Sahara region, but there is much less rainfall in southern Africa. So this is important because it creates these gradients in food resources, which could be a driver for human but also animal migration. And if we think about climate provides essentially the net primary productivity, which is the source of food of animals, mammals in particular, and we're also just a mammal. So we congregate where there is food. And this is called the pull scenario. And you can also imagine that an area becomes very dry, such as in the example here, southeastern Africa. If that is the case, the land cannot maintain a high population density. There are not many food resources. So existing groups start to migrate away, or they split because the group is too large to survive in a certain dry area. And both of these scenarios, of course, have also implications for interbreeding and also for genetic diversification. So the pull scenario brings people maybe from different areas together, starting to mix, genetically interbreed, which means we have a homogenization effect in the genetic diversity, whereas the push scenario is probably a scenario where we'll generate coalescence or divergence in genetic lineages. Okay, this one is driven by genetic divergence, and we will probably also have higher competition. Smaller number of people fight for the same scarce food resources. So you can say food availability driven by climate and rainfall and temperature is the engine for survival, but also mobility of our species. Okay, we simulated this in 2016 using a climate model, which is providing the forcing for another numerical model, which actually simulates the human population density. And you will see that we'll start off with a idealized patch of human Homo sapiens here in Central Eastern Africa. And as the movie runs, you will see how this group of Homo sapiens actually spreads the world in the search for food resources, following essentially the main areas where food is available. Okay, I'll just run it forward. You can see this is a timer, 120,000 years ago. That's when we started. And you see that they're starting to disperse in low numbers now. This is the first out of Africa around 100,000 years ago. They start to spread along the coastlines into Asia. Still relatively low population numbers in Europe. Now, because the sea level starts to drop down, we are in a glacial period. We have a connection between East Asia and Indonesia. And eventually they can also, with some island hopping, get over into Australia, but they need to have the capability to cross some of the Indonesian passages, actually. And then for some time, around 30,000 years ago, they're kind of stuck up in Eastern Siberia. There is still an ice sheet there. This is all climate model simulation. And then around 14,000 years ago, this ice sheet disappears, and we have essentially the humans spreading into the Americas. So this looks rather realistic, and you can compare it, and you can run different scenarios. You could run the same scenario in the computer by not changing the astronomical factors, the so-called Milankovitch cycles. You can keep it under glacial conditions and see what would our present human population look like. And the scenarios are very different. So can use the climate model actually to run different scenarios and look at the possible projected outcomes in human population density. Okay, so this was our very first attempt, and I am not sure if I'm the first one showing some equations. Don't get scared. I will explain with the symbols what these equations mean. So we ran simulations where we looked at the interaction between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And you know that Neanderthals died out around 38,000 years ago. And the question is why? Is it because humans outcompeted them in some way? Or is it because of rapid climate change? There were some Danskar-Oeschger events. So there are many different hypotheses, of course, regarding this one. And we wanted to test quantitatively these hypotheses. So we built a human dispersal model. It's based on so-called reaction diffusion equations. And this is the density of Neanderthals, the density of Homo sapiens, and the time change. Okay, so they're moving around, so that will drive their time change. So this is the diffusion term. Then we have a birth term, if you like, the growth term. This just represents how many individuals get born in a certain time step. Then we have this so-called logistic term, which characterizes two things. One is it characterizes how, for a given carrying capacity, food resources, how many people can survive on a certain grid point. And this is an interaction term, so it tells us the competition. So this is the food availability. Now, Homo sapiens has to share the food resources with the Neanderthals, depending on the density. So this is there is a factor here that tells us how much more competitive Neanderthals are over the Homo sapiens or the other way around. We ignore here the inbreeding factor, and we also included an interbreeding because we know Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred. I have 2.5% Neanderthal DNA. So that's quite clear, and this is the third hypothesis, that actually Neanderthals, they didn't get extinct. They just were assimilated in the Homo sapiens, and in fact, if we take all human beings together nowadays, there is still 50% of the Neanderthal DNA scattered around in different individuals. Each of us only has about 2-point-something% of the Eurasians, but if we put it together, it's about half of a Neanderthal. Okay, so these models are quite nice. You can link demography with climate quite easily. But unfortunately, these models don't have agents. There is no age, no gender, and I will come back to that later on because we are also using agent-based models to address these questions. Okay, there was a little animation there at the top that actually, if we run it once more, I hope it works. Well, maybe not. I will just show the main result here. Okay, so these are the snapshots from the animations, and what you can see is Homo sapiens is the green guy, and as they are moving into Europe around 53,000 years ago, they start to essentially replace the Neanderthals wherever they are, and this is because we gave them a slightly higher competition. So 10% competitive advantage of Homo sapiens over Neanderthals is sufficient to kill off essentially the Neanderthals, and then around 38,000 years ago, nobody is left. This is competition for the same food resources. And keep in mind, this is under glacial times, so the food resources are still relatively scarce. Okay, you can see this here. This is a population of Neanderthals, global population, and you see the major decline around 40,000 years ago. This is all simulated in a computer. And we can run this now with different climate scenarios. One of the hypotheses was that Neanderthals disappeared because there was abrupt climate change associated with Dunskard-Oeschger events. We can test it. We have Dunskard-Oeschger events included in our climate forcing. We can turn it on and off. There is no difference there. So this is a way of quantitatively actually assessing some of these main hypotheses. Okay, let me go back a few steps and ask some more basic questions here. Did past climate influence human habitats? We will talk about habitats, adaptation, selection, speciation, migration, genetic diversity, or if you put it all together, human evolution. Well, each of them seems like a major research program, but I wanted to give you a few highlights of how we can actually address these questions. And this is done through a marriage of many different disciplines. In Korea, the word convergence is used. I think it's a wonderful opportunity also for the younger generation to get involved in learning something about the other disciplines, because after all, science is about learning something new. So we actually try to combine here information from paleogenomics, anthropology, archaeology, paleoclimate, and in paleoclimate we have two sources of data. We have proxy data, sediment cores, ice cores, speleotherms, and we have climate models. So both of them can provide very valuable insight into the climate conditions under which early humans actually existed. And then also we need to have some information on biology. So we can try to link these things together, either dynamically, but I will focus here more on a statistical modeling link. So that helps us to quantify this paleo-climate-human linkages. Okay, how do we do that? By clicking to the next slide, which apparently, here we go. What do we need? We need to know who, so which species, which human species lived where, when, and what the climate conditions were like. So these are the kind of four major questions that we need to address. And we will focus our study here on the climate and the human evolution of the last 2.5 million years. And let's ask the first question: what do we need? Well, we need to know who and when and where. Okay, so by collaborating with our colleague Pasquale Raya from University of Naples, we were able to get information on essentially the species. This is one column in an Axel sheet, longitude and latitude, and this is where archaeologists and anthropologists have either found bones that they were able to identify or lithics, stone tools. And we also need to have the age, and age comes also with uncertainty that depends on the chronological constraints of these sites. So in this study, we focus only on essentially 5 groups. So Homo habilis and Ergaster, they are clumped together as early African Homo. Okay, so this is the largest compilation of archaeological and anthropological data covering this time period from 3 million years ago to 30,000 years ago. It has about 3,200 entries, so we can do some nice statistics with that. Okay, we also need to know the climate conditions. At each of these sites, we need to know temperature, precipitation, and net primary productivity, because that's a proxy for food resources. Okay, unfortunately, we don't have as many speleotherms. We don't have enough sediment cores. We don't have enough tree rings, and so on and so forth, in order to address that question on a site-specific basis. So instead, what we're doing is we use a climate model, a global climate model, and that covers this entire time period. The problem was nobody has ever done something like this, running a climate model for 3 million years, a comprehensive global climate model. So, but thanks to the supercomputer of our center, which is actually in the building next to this one, it's located in the Daejeon headquarter center, we were able to do the longest climate model simulation ever conducted with a coupled general circulation model. And this was done by Kyung-Soo Kyun from our center. So what you're seeing here is just the global mean temperature. And as I mentioned, we have this gradual cooling. This is the Pliocene, the beginning of the Pleistocene. Here's the mid-Pleistocene transition, where suddenly the frequency and the amplitude of the glacial cycles changes. And by the way, we can also use the same climate model then just to run into the future. Okay, so a few words. What we need to drive this climate model, this coupled general circulation model, is information about the astronomical changes in Earth's radiation, insolation, and that's just astronomy. We need to know something about how the ice sheets changed. We use another climate model for that. And we need to know the greenhouse gas forcings, and there are some issues with that one. If you want, we can discuss it in the break. Okay, all of these forcings, so greenhouse gas forcing, ice sheets, and astronomical forcings are put onto a climate model, global climate model, state-of-the-art, at a rather low resolution, 3.6 degrees horizontal resolution. So each grid box is about 400 kilometers large. It's not kilometer-wise because the supercomputing resources don't even exist on our planet to do it this way. Okay, then we do some downscaling, and finally, by linking temperature, precipitation, and net primary productivity with the mentioned data, fossil and archaeological data, we can finally check on all of them what, who, where, and when. Okay, so first question is, how good is this climate model simulation? It's a, I should say, a climate model is not a statistical model. It doesn't extrapolate anything. It's just a set of equations, physics equations that we are solving on a supercomputer. So we need to check how good is this simulation compared to existing proxies. And I'm just giving you a little snapshot here, a little selection, last 2 million years to present. This is the simulated temperature in orange in the tropics, and in blue is a reconstructed temperature from several marine sediment cores. And you can see, well, the amplitude actually fits quite nicely. There seems to be a bit of an offset. There are some issues with the timing here of some of this variability. That's something we need to consider. But overall, it looks quite realistic. Then we can go for other proxies. These are proxies that are more sensitive to precipitation changes, and these ones are more sensitive to temperature changes. And in red, you always have the reconstruction, either from stalagmites, from lake cores, from marine sediment cores, and so on. And what you can see is, in particular, the tropical precessional variability that we see in some of the main cave sites, for instance, in China, monsoon shifts on 20,000 year timescale, is nicely resolved. Whereas in temperature, we have much more than 80 to 120,000 year variability, at least during the last 400,000 years. Okay, so that gives us some confidence that the model is actually doing the right thing. And let's look at the very first simple diagnostic here. We just show the average net primary productivity over the last 3 million years. And this is the color. And we just throw in all the sites, the 3,200 sites that we have. And we can ask the question, where did early humans actually hang out? What was their preferred area? Well, the first thing is we see, well, they like to be mostly in areas where there is food, right? That's not a surprise. Actually, there are some interesting areas here. We can come back to that later on. These areas we have food sometimes, in particular with a precessional cycle, but not continuously averaged. So, but essentially we need food, that's good, but we have areas with very high net primary productivity where we have absolutely no sites. Maybe because archaeologists don't like to get Ebola and they don't go into these sites. Maybe it's because there is a lot of carbon turnover in these areas, so archaeological sites will be quickly erased, or it is because nobody was there. We don't know, but that's interesting. Or nobody was there. We can ask the question, if nobody was there, maybe it was pathogens. These areas are very high in pathogen densities. Okay, so these are hypotheses we can test. And then there has been this very influential variability selection hypothesis of Rick Potts, who argues that actually humans adapted to changes in variability. According to this hypothesis, we would see higher density in areas where there is a higher variability in net primary productivity. That doesn't seem to be the case. If we overall look into these sites, these are sites where the variability in climate is relatively small. So essentially, we are just variability avoiders. We are not really variability seekers. We are not thrill seekers. We try to be in rather stable couch potato-like environments. Okay, good. Let's talk a little bit more how we link climate and humans in detail. And I'm showing here just a schematic. Let's say these are some sites. This is a skull and this is some stone tool that we have. For each of them has a specific location, also time. And then for each of the locations and times, we can figure out, okay, what were the climatic conditions at that site? And then we can essentially project the so-called habitat or biotope into a climate niche. And the climate niche is the projection here of all of these data onto a climatic space. Make it simple, I just show precipitation and temperature, but we can make essentially a projection onto a higher dimensional manifold. We use 4 dimensions in our study. Okay, this is important because from this climate niche, we can also determine probabilities. How likely for a given climatic variable combination is it to find a human site, human specimen? And this is just illustrated here for Neanderthals. These are all the locations where we have a Neanderthal data in temperature precipitation space. And so for this climate condition, the probability is 0 to find a Neanderthal, right? Whereas if these are the climate conditions, we have a very high probability, and this is called habitat suitability. We can calculate it more formally by using the so-called Mahalanobis distance. I won't go through all the details, but just to suffice to say, it is a way of using existing data where we have human presence, linking this with the climatic conditions, and then using this linkage, this map, in order to extrapolate for given climatic conditions, what would be the likelihood to find Homo sapiens there potentially, right? So this is illustrated here. This is for Homo erectus. These are all the Homo erectus sites. And this is the habitat where Homo erectus could have lived, right? And you can see, well, there are locations where the environmental conditions were very suitable, and they should have lived there if they had been there. And it turns out actually they were there, but nowadays they're called Homo ergaster, and in the older literature they're called African Homo erectus. Okay, so that gives you some idea how we can marry climate data with anthropological data to build these maps of habitat suitability. To look at this for all of these main 4-5 groups, we will take a closer look. This is Homo sapiens here, all the sites all the way to 30,000 years ago. And we have some clustering in certain areas, Southern Africa, Europe, and so on. But the blue shading in the background illustrates whether the conditions were suitable for Homo sapiens presence. And what we can see is, well, there are certain areas that are very, very suitable. Actually, it turns out they were very suitable for each of the Homo species that we are looking at. And one of them is the Southern African region. We have always a stripe of high habitat suitability. And another area is the Mediterranean. And also Madagascar, by the way. So what is common to these environments? These are Mediterranean climates. So each of these Homo species, if we had thrown them into the Mediterranean at some point, they would have been fine there. So this is like the common environment, the common climatic niche that all of our earlier ancestors shared. But from there, we can see there are major differences, right? So these guys, they didn't migrate farther out. They did not expand their climatic and geographic niche. Neanderthals, well, they were very much adapted to Eurasian climates. Heidelbergensis a bit more universal, and Homo sapiens became the master of all trades. They were able eventually to survive everywhere. So we can see just by looking at this blue map, the range of climatic conditions that they adapted to. This is what I just showed was the temporal mean over the existence of this human species in their habitat. Okay, but it turns out that our climate model produces temperature, precipitation, net primary productivity for the last 3 million years. So we have actually time series for every location on our planet, essentially in these grid boxes in the climate model. We can calculate for each of these species the habitat suitability. And I will just document this here. Let's say this is a very famous site, Jebel Irhoud, where we have a skull that some people argue belongs to an earlier version, archaic version of Homo sapiens already. And it turns out, well, true. According to our model simulation, we have a very high habitat suitability here. So that makes sense. However, other earlier species, such as that one would be Homo heidelbergensis, they probably did not like that area. And also this one would be the early African species, that they did not enjoy this kind of climatic environment according to the model study. And as you can see, if we go to this area where we have a very famous skull, the Turkana boy, the habitat suitability is not fixed. It changes over time, and it changes with the Milankovitch cycles, with these astronomical forcings. So this is the precessional cycle 20,000 years ago. You remember Earth's axis wobble, but you see the amplitude modulation there of 100 and 400,000 years. These are 100,000-year packages. These are the 400,000-year packages. This is the eccentricity cycle modulating the habitat suitability. So we can see the effect of astronomical forcings on human habitats. So this is essentially a way of looking at the astronomical theory of human dispersal or habitats, at least. And well, if we go to Northern Europe, we can see that this Neanderthals, I don't know how that works. Neanderthals, here we go. The red line, they enjoyed being in Europe, in Germany, Neanderthal, only in interglacial periods. Whenever there was a glacial period, the habitat suitability was terrible, which means they had to move southward. So by looking at this habitat gradients, we can actually determine the direction also of potential dispersals. Okay, this is illustrated here in a movie. So this is showing the likelihood in some way or habitat suitability of Homo sapiens. And there are certain areas where you have a very stable condition. So whatever the climate is, they don't care. But there are other areas, in particular this one. I can maybe go back. No, I can't. Okay, this one, between Central Africa and Southern Africa, you see these corridors forming. And these are corridors which are driven by, again, Earth's axis wobble, creating these green corridors where suddenly humans can survive and move between East and West. And that is actually a very important player in human genetic diversification as well. Okay, so we can go a little bit deeper. What time is it? I haven't even... How much time do I have? Okay, so we can ask the question a little bit more specifically. What kind of biomes, what kind of vegetation conditions did we like? I mean, it's not like we're eating climate, right? We're eating something that grows on land, so we need to know the detailed information on biomes. What is a biome? Well, tundra, desert, savanna, these are biomes. So these are ecosystem classifications on the terrestrial, in the terrestrial realm. Okay, so we can take the same data that I mentioned earlier on. So from 2 million years ago to present, and what we are plotting here is for each of them represents an individual site where somebody has found a tooth, where somebody has found a skull or some tool, and we locate for the position and the age the net primary productivity in a climate model. And so what we see is that this early human groups, in black, the early archaic African groups, and ignore the Homo erectus, they like to be in a rather dry area with a net primary productivity of 200 to 400 grams carbon per year per square meter. And this is actually Mediterranean climate. We talked about it already earlier. This is the origin of our genus. We were Mediterranean climate dwellers. Okay, and so Mediterranean climate is not only in Italy and Spain, but it is also in Southern Africa and elsewhere. Then with the new groups, Homo heidelbergensis in particular, starting to emerge around 800,000 years ago, you can see that this net primary productivity range, the niche, if you like, starts to expand. And it turns out that this expansion of the climatic niche also follows the overall encephalization trend. We are starting to get bigger brains over time. We, meaning our ancestors, we probably get smaller brains because we rely more on technology. Then we have around 800,000 years ago, we have the controlled use of fire. So that allows people actually to live in very dry and cold environments suddenly. And that's very important because this is a way of adapting to different climatic conditions. Developing new tools, social skills allows us to broaden this climatic niche. And then eventually, of course, Homo sapiens became the master of all traits, the master of all biomes, if you like. We were able to settle in areas where there's almost nothing to eat and where there is a lot to eat. So this is Homo sapiens. This is the expansion of our niche due to cultural evolution. Okay, and you can see also some of it is illustrated here. The tools get more sophisticated and so on as a result of our way of dealing with the environment and also changing, adapting to the environment, but also changing our environment. Okay, to go a little bit more into the biome types, which is actually quite interesting, what specific food resources did these different human species prefer? Elke Zeller, my PhD student, she had a paper 2 months ago in Science where she looks at the preferred biome conditions for Homo habilis and Homo ergaster. And the first thing you see is actually, they prefer mostly grassland and dry shrubland. Many textbooks nowadays still talk about the savanna hypothesis and so on. No, savanna is maybe the second or third dominant biome for these very early human groups. And then, so this goes with age. These are the oldest one, Homo erectus. As they venture out into Eurasia, they actually, for the first time, start to adapt to tropical forest or different types of forest. Then Homo heidelbergensis, very important group. You can see the first time we have the boreal forest popping up. So that requires essentially survival skills, that requires use of clothing, a controlled use of fire, because winter conditions can be very cold in boreal forest regions. And Homo neanderthalensis is the first one to adapt to tundra conditions. So that requires additional methods. And then, of course, Homo sapiens, the master of all biomes, we finally occupied all of these biomes. And that's kind of important, because we can also link the cultural evolution with the expansion of our human niche. There is another way of looking at the same data. We can, for each of the human groups, for the different continents, we can see which biomes did they populate most preferably. And let's look here. I think this is the most interesting one, Asia. So you can see most of this biome, you can look it up, is grassland. So most of the, let's say, humans that lived in Asia around 500,000 years, so 2 million years to 30,000 years ago, most of it is in grassland. But you can also see every once in a while, this grassland area becomes dominant. And every once in a while, you see actually they share the habitat between temperate forest and grassland. And this is clearly a climatic signal. So you can clearly see the glacial interglacial cycles in here, having an important role on the available biomes and also humans adapting and following these biomes. For Europe, it's a different story. Again, temperate forest is a big preference, grassland, but every once in a while you also have this adaptation to the boreal forest environment. So this is just linking archaeological data with climate model data and vegetation model data. There is no sophisticated statistics involved, and this is just like very straightforward lookup tables, if you like. Okay, I mentioned already this adaptation here. We can ask the next question. Can this information be used to say anything about speciation? In particular, there is this really debated question: who is the ancestor of Homo sapiens? Some people think we probably emerge in different places at the same time. This is a multi-regional idea. Others have thought that maybe there are still certain areas on our planet where our species actually emerged from a different predecessor species. Well, let's take a look what happens. So the very first skull that we can clearly say is a modern Homo sapiens or anatomically modern human is Kibish, 200 to 230,000 years ago in Eastern Africa. Then we have a kind of mixed skull from Florisbad in Southern Africa 260,000 years ago, and Broken Hill in Zambia 300,000 years ago. So something is happening there. If we look at this, this is a time period where Heidelbergensis, essentially, this is a hybrid, and this is the Homo sapiens. This is a critical time period of the transition between Homo heidelbergensis and also the Homo sapiens. Now, interestingly, this is also the time, how deep, 3 minutes? How deep we can trace our human genetic ancestry on the mitochondrial DNA. So if we look at mitochondrial DNA, each of us here got it from the mothers, so we can trace it essentially through the maternal lineage. And there we end up with a time period, well, we call it the mitochondrial Eve concept. There are some issues, 200 to 300,000 years ago. So interestingly, also the group that has the oldest lineage right now is still living in the Kalahari area. These are the Kusan Bushmen. And so there is something speaking to that, but we wanted to just test this hypothesis. And the idea is that the daughter species and the parent species, when they overlap, when the daughter species emerge from the parent species, they should have lived in the same region, and they should have also shared the same environment and preferences. So we can calculate the habitat overlap. And what we see is for Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis, the overlap was clearly in Europe. So this is very clear anagenetic transition speciation event. So now for Homo sapiens and Homo heidelbergensis, it's interesting. The only area that really sticks out where they had the same habitat preferences is essentially in Southern Africa. So this is an extra, completely independent evidence for the possibility that this transition between Homo heidelbergensis and Homo sapiens actually occurred in that area. Okay, so I don't have much time to talk about it. Here's kind of the summary of this. By looking at the habitat suitabilities, the climate niche, and doing statistics on this niche, we can learn something about speciation events. Heidelbergensis in Europe, the Eurasian Heidelbergensis in Europe, gradually around 400,000 years ago, developed into Neanderthalensis. So there is no major cladogenic transition. It's an anagenetic transition, rather gradual and smooth. So same actually also for Homo heidelbergensis. There are so many similarities in the transitional time period that we think that Southern Africa is still the most likely candidate for this speciation from heidelbergensis to Neanderthal to us. Okay, with that, I will probably just show you the main conclusion here. Okay, what have we discussed? Milankovitch cycles, the astronomical forcings, they actually play a role in this habitat suitability. We could trace their effect on whether climate is suitable or not. Then the age and location of human artifacts is not random, but affected by climate variations. I didn't show that, but if you're interested in that, you can check out our paper. It's an interesting finding. Then the global migrations, the global dispersal began kind of after the mid-Pleistocene transition around 800,000 years ago. That's something that we can relate also to the changes in climate. Positive migration, encephalization, and adaptation feedback starts to occur around 600,000 years ago. And then we showed very briefly that Homo heidelbergensis, I should have brought a skull, they're so nice, shared habitat with Homo sapiens in Southern Africa around the time when the main speciation, the main transition occurred. And these overlaps in habitat are a very nice way actually of learning something about species transitions. So again, no complicated statistics involved here, just linking, marrying climate and anthropological and archaeological data. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Okay, so from now, Professor Timmermann will answer the question from the audience. So please raise your hand if you have questions.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. I'm a sociologist, so I'm not a historian nor a human evolutionist. And this is actually my second lecture on human evolution in my life. The first one being Dr. Kim's. So I learned a lot. I think this is absolutely fascinating. And because of my lack of knowledge, I'm afraid I can only ask something that's quite normative rather than positivistic or anything of theoretical substance. My question is based on the diets that are kind of prevalent these days that are supposedly based on these theories of human evolution. For example, paleo diets, they claim that, by eating meat, human brains grew much bigger, and eating meat continuously, having meat as like the main source of food these days will be beneficial for human health. On the other hand, there's the vegan diets that claim that, our teeth formation actually resembles something that's much more kind of like, vegetable-based diets. So I'm actually wondering, you've discussed the biomes, but I'm actually wondering what kind of foods that they've actually consumed during those times, and whether you think that those types of foods, whether their decisions should affect and influence now living in this era.
Wow, the now is difficult to address, but so there is one clue that I did not actually explain. By looking at the connection between humans and biomes, we found something rather remarkable, and that is that Homo sapiens and Heidelbergensis and Neanderthals, they were unique as compared to everybody else before, because they like to be in biomes, different biomes nearby. They had locations where the biome diversity in the neighborhood was very high. So we don't like to be in the middle of a savanna, right? And if the next 300 kilometers is only savanna, that's not a good place to be. But if you're at the margin of a temperate forest, and savanna here and maybe another biome nearby, well, then you buffer your diets in some way. You're starting to say, okay, maybe seasonally even you can say, well, in summertime we have some antelopes coming in, let's grab some antelopes from the savanna, and so on and so forth. So we became essentially adapted to biome diversity, which is very interesting. And I think it tells us something about the resilience that we developed also against climatic changes. Imagine the savanna burns down and there is no food available, and well, still you can go nearby to your forest and eat some monkeys. So exaggerating now, but so this is it comes out of the data very, very clearly and is statistically significant. So looking at that, I think that we were extremely good in diversifying our food resources. What type of food resources they consumed, this is something that nowadays people who study the teeth in particular, the way it is, the abrasion of your teeth and so on, and that depends on the environment, what is available. I don't think there is a common thing. Clearly, we didn't grow at that time, we didn't grow any crops and so on, so we didn't have any, and starch would be coming mostly from roots in certain areas. The reason, for instance, why Southern Africa is such a great area is because there are roots everywhere. Unlike in other areas of Africa, Southern Africa, even in the Kalahari Desert, you dig a little bit, you find roots, they have starch and they have water. So I think the regional details will determine what they ate. So I don't think paleo diet, the word doesn't even make sense, because the people living in South Africa, they probably had a very different diet from somebody who lived in Germany under glacial conditions. So then your second question about what we do right now. Or I would just say we are, of course, diversifying our food resources. Just go to the Shinsege food court next door. But we are not diversifying actually our environment. We are creating monocultures everywhere we go. And that is something that will probably haunt us, because climate change will affect monocultures in a very, very dramatic way, and that can cause food insecurities and so on. So I think the idea from the ancients is like diversify your portfolio in terms of food resources and environments. Maybe that's a lesson for us to learn. Sorry, long answer.
Thank you very much for a really inspiring lecture, Dr. Timmermann. And I'm also not a geologist or ecologist. I'm a human geographer. And probably I just wanted to push this what I learned from your lecture to think about the future a little bit. So I understand humans have the ability of humans to adapt to changing environment has been the key driver of the human evolution. That's one of the main messages from your lecture. And then I was thinking, we talk about this Anthropocene and the importance of how we can survive and so on. And I was wondering if so this modeling-based thinking would allow us to think about where the habitat stability of the future humans. So like where our future generations will hang out in these climate changing situations.
Right. So there is an interesting concept. I mean, you see this habitat suitability changes over time. If we looked at a few 100,000 years and things change, but if we looked at the habitats right now, they change so quickly. Essentially, in our movie, that would be just an instant. So what happens if the habitat changes is if you're not adapted to it, and let's say people in a lot of rural areas, they're not adapted to these rapid climate changes, or mammals living wild mammals, they suddenly see this transition in habitats based on global warming, based on land use change, and so on. So if they can't adapt to it, they have to move. So is there enough place to go to? That's the question. But there is a pressure on dispersal. And I think, well, we are climate refugees. Our entire Earth, our entire history is that of climate refugees. Not only mine, I left Germany to go to Hawaii. That was kind of climate refugee thing, but wherever the climatic conditions were not suitable, we moved away if we could. Otherwise, we just got extinct locally. So this is the message. We are creating a huge stress on our environment. Forests can't move easily. Mammals can't move easily because there is a lot of land use change. And let's say humans in rural areas, they can't move easily to build a farm 100 kilometers further away because there is somebody else owning that farm already, or that land. So I think that it will create a huge pressure. And I think one of the worst consequences that we will experience as a result of global warming is climate refugees. We are taking away the habitat of many, many people on our planet, either sea level rise or changes in temperature and so on. And then the second one is, of course, you can think about the habitat of crops, right? So we know that all the crops currently, they grow already at their optimum temperature. If we move the temperature higher, then usually the yield curve of crops starts to decrease. So people were able to genetically modify plants for drought conditions, but the temperature DNA information is scattered over so many parts of the genome of the plant. Nobody has figured it out how to make them more temperature resistant. So you're pushing also crops outside their normal habitat, which means the yield will drop down. And so associated with the climatic stress, we will have food insecurity stress. And that will affect people, of course, in areas that are high population density and very low carrying capacity, and that would be in particular the Middle East. So we can apply some of these concepts to understand also the climatic stress. However, nowadays things are connected, right? So we can obtain food resources from different areas and so on. So we have buffering capacity in the system, which allows us to in some way adapt. But because climate change is so fast and so drastic, we need to develop better adaptation strategies in order to obtain the or minimize the impact on human civilizations everywhere, and not only in the global north.
Okay, it will be the last questions.
Thank you for this truly informative and illustrative talk. My question is very short. So how does this climate geo context of human evolution, how does it well explain the diversification of human race within Homo sapiens? That's one question. And the second question is that, so now we have a different capacity of the making of the built environment in our human society. So given that, how does this pattern will expect the future evolution of our own species?
Yeah, I don't like the word human race, to be honest. So of course, our human species has many different genetic flavors. And I think there's a better way of characterizing this. So the interesting thing is the migration actually plays a phenomenal role in creating genetic diversity. So we all in this room have, I don't see anyone from Africa here, obviously. Everybody in this room has probably a common grand blah, blah, blah mother 60,000 years ago who came out of Africa. So we're all Africans genetically, but still, if we look at our genetics, we will find major differences, even though we all belong to the same L3 mitochondrial DNA clade. And these differences are because different groups migrated to different areas, stayed in this area, and developed their own mutations, which then accumulated and gave them different genotypes and also phenotypes. And so nowadays, of course, we have much more mixing happening on our planet. So interbreeding between different groups and so on will create more homogeneity, genetic homogeneity. Well, of course, country borders and ethnical and traditional borders, culture borders in our brain, they still keep that genetic diversity happening. So regarding your question on the future of the, let's say, human diversity, I would rather call it, well, we are now in the possession of something very terrifying, and there's CRISPR. And I think that's going to drive our genotype modification much more than any of the dynamics that we are dealing with. And that's the scary part. CRISPR is going to change our human identity, combined maybe with AI implanted in our brains or whatever. I don't know where that goes. And maybe we will not be here. Maybe we will just be somewhere uploaded somewhere. But let's not make this a science fiction ending. I think we are special because we have genetic diversity, we have cultural diversity, and it's the fact that we have a connected brain in some way that really makes the Homo sapiens species so powerful. And I think in this way, we should also think as a connected brain and not just as individual quantities and with racism and whatever gender equality in between. We are just one, and essentially we are just Africans. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for giving really nice talk. Okay, and thank you for being all part of this special lecture, and please enjoy your lunch. And